deposits. And we started as an app optimizing Aave compound and providing better rates. And now we have an Infra, which is a Morpho lending and borrowing protocol on top of which you can rebuild any lending app, essentially.
Hi, I'm Devin Walsh. I'm the Executive Director of the Uniswap Foundation. We are a grant-making nonprofit focused on supporting the growth and sustainability of the Uniswap protocol and ecosystem. Today I'm excited to dig into the next version of Uniswap, which transforms Uniswap into a true protocol platform.
Yes, hello, I'm Sam MacPherson. I'm co-founder and CEO of Phoenix Labs, and we are active contributor to Spark, which is a lending market attached to Maker's liquidity to offer the best DAI borrow rates in DeFi.
Awesome, thank you everyone. So to get started on the topic, I think there are a lot of different ways that you could address this first. So I think it would be good to start by defining what do we mean by an application or a DeFi app becoming more like infrastructure. So Paul, would you like to kick off the conversation there?
Yeah, sure. So the way we define DeFi as apps and as infrastructure is like DeFi apps are directly used by DeFi end users, while DeFi infrastructures are used by builders, by developers, right? And so like the thing that triggered this talk essentially is that in the very early days, most DeFi protocols were directly usable by users. Like if you think of Uniswap v2, like Maker, Aave, Compound, etc. And the general mental model for this talk is that we're moving from those apps to infrastructure where you have more Maker core with sub-DAOs being the apps. You have Uniswap before with hooks and entire dexes that can be built as apps on top of Uniswap before. You have Morpho and on top vaults that can be entire lending protocols on top of this infrastructure.
Yeah, and just to build off of Paul's point, I think the note around developers truly becoming a first-class citizen in the protocol is truly what differentiates an app protocol from a platform protocol. And in the case of Uniswap v4, which is the next version of Uniswap coming out later this year, you really see the developers who have always been building on top of Uniswap, developers who maybe for V2 or V3 may have built an integration, have much more flexibility in what they can build, and at the same time, be able to focus much more narrowly and specifically on the innovation they want to introduce, worrying less about the security of an entirely new AMM that they have to build to try and innovate. Without having to worry about business, BDing, doing business development to get users to come to use their specific interface. They get the distribution just by virtue of building into Uni v4 as a first-class citizen in the protocol.
Yeah, you see this trend across all of DeFi, I think. As Paul said, with Maker, back in the day, it was more user-focused. As one of the oldest DeFi protocols, maybe some of you remember the old interface, opening up a CDP and minting a single collateral DAI. This is very user-facing, but these days, especially with the restructuring under the endgame and sub-DAOs, which are kind of more like user-facing mini versions of Maker that are oriented towards growth and development, Maker Core itself is more just becoming a wholesale bulk lender to these sub-DAOs. And then these sub-DAOs, Spark being one of them, that's probably the most well-known, can then focus more on the end user. It's similar. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same, but there's a lot of similarities between central bank and commercial bank relationships, where the sub-DAOs are more the commercial, and Maker can benefit from the scale of this whole system.
Okay, that's great. So what I'm hearing is you're taking these protocols and you're aiming them more at developers instead of retail, and you're unlocking new possibilities. What are the benefits of doing so, and how does that ultimately help DeFi scale? And I guess scale in multiple ways, right? There are different ways it could scale to more users, unlocking more capital, things like that. So anyone who wants to jump in here, please feel free.
Yeah, for sure. I can take that, I guess. So Maker, I would say, previously was hitting a lot of growing pains with the DAO, and so this giant monolithic structure trying to do everything, trying to do real-world assets, trying to do DeFi lending, all this stuff in one. There was political factions forming within the DAO, and so like this is not going to scale up. So as part of the endgame restructuring with these sub-DAOs can specialize in different things. So the Spark sub-DAO is focused on DeFi integrations, and specifically that we are not tooled up for traditional finance. That's an entirely different set of people. The people within Spark are more like smart contract developers, auditors, that kind of stuff. Whereas in the real-world asset sub-DAOs, which are focused on mostly investing into T-bills at this time, they are more like lawyers, traditional finance people. And so when you silo these things out, and then you have multiple redundant versions of these, you get this sort of competitive, specialized nature, and Maker as a whole can then scale up through this process.
Yeah, I think to piggyback off of that a bit, I am extremely excited about Uniswap v4 from the perspective of just someone who exists within the crypto space. I think the design of v4 specifically will allow for a much faster path towards more innovation. It will allow for a much faster, cheaper iteration upon different ways to scale and make DeFi more flexible and able to suit a number of different users and use cases. And just to throw out a few different examples, for one, as I mentioned a bit before, to innovate upon AMM design today, you have to build a new AMM. And that may entail just forking Uniswap using some of that code, but innovating depends upon tweaking the curve, whatever it may be. That is extremely expensive to audit and introduces a massive risk area in terms of the amount of complexity being introduced, et cetera. It also is very expensive and time-consuming to bootstrap liquidity, to understand how your innovation actually works and functions, to see if it even works how you think it might work. The distribution element is another one. Being able to leverage the distribution embedded within a protocol which already exists and has connections with routers and aggregators. And lastly, more in terms of the flexibility that's unlocked, hooks really enable developers to enable a path to be composable with many other primitives that exist within the space. And two that we've seen that I'm particularly excited about are incorporating Flashbot Suave order flow auctions directly into a hook at the point of a swap or liquidity provision, and ZK coprocessors, which allow for really mind-blowing ability to customize swapper experience based on history and things like that.
For me, I think moving from app to infra enables mainly 4 things, which are security, efficiency, scalability, and network effects. So on the security side of things, like as Sam was mentioning on the maker side of things, when you're trying to do everything at the same time, well, you introduce more smart contract risk and more economic risk. And that's been the case in almost every single vertical of DeFi. And in our case, in lending, we've been building for 2 years on top of lending pools, right? On top of Aave Compound. And we found that building on top of what was supposed to be the infrastructure, but that was upgradable, the code changes all the time, that has more than 700 different risk parameters that are changed real time. That made it very hard from a security perspective to build on top. Now on the efficiency side of things, there is kind of the same idea when you're an app and you're trying to do everything at the same time, sort of you have to lower your efficiency in order to be able to tackle all those use cases in one specific instance. Then on the scalability side of things, in the case of Uniswap before, there are so many different things you could do with an AMM, and you can't factor everything in one. And so now you have this sort of permissionless creation nature that lets you anyone build and innovate whatever they want without limits. And then most importantly, so the infrastructure layer is focusing on providing this just very simple, very secure, and very efficient, primitive, whether it's stablecoins, whether it's DEX, whether it's lending. And the most interesting side of this is the network effect and the state that gets aggregated into the instance. So in the case of Make a Core, the network effects of DAI is like huge, right? And like it makes all the sub-DAOs benefit from it. In the case of Uniswap before, you have one smart contract that is going to aggregate all the state and all the liquidity. You know, they'll benefit from integrations on top, like, you know, maybe Uniswap X from Uniswap Labs, or like Arrakis Finance that is building a bunch of things on top. And in the case of lending, in the case of Morpho Blue, so we have those micro primitive lending markets on top of which you can rebuild any lending pool, whether it's like the Aave v3, Compound v3, like, you know, Compound v2, like models. But the interesting thing is that if you have multiple vaults building on top, they all benefit from a shared state. So shared liquidity, in that case, to the extent that they share risk. And that's like, I'd say the superpower of the infrastructure is that it, like this aggregation of the state unlocks levels of liquidity and efficiency that I think will be second to one when you compare to traditional finance at scale.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Really good to hear about. I think we've really explored in depth a lot of the stuff that's happening behind the scenes. Next, I want to shift the conversation more towards what this means for the end user, the people who are actually logging on and going to Uniswap or maybe going to Spark Protocol and interacting with those apps. How will these improvements affect them? How will it make their lives easier?
Yeah, I can take that one first. I see two core benefits that come for end users from Uniswap v4. One is better execution for everyone, which is great, right? I think some of the hooks that we've already been seeing developed are focused, for instance, on either MEV mitigation or redistribution to end users. In Istanbul at DevConnect, we had a hackathon entirely focused upon MEV-focused hooks and saw some really exciting examples. For instance, a hook that would auction off the first transaction in a block, for instance, and redistribute the proceeds from that to the swapper directly. So hooks like that can be incorporated across all pools as a hook. And the second category is more specific experiences built into a hook for specific use cases, users, or jurisdictions. So one kind of hook that we think will unlock growth to the more trad world are, for instance, OFAC compliant hooks, which may be controversial, but for sure people are already kind of thinking about those kinds of hooks. On top of that, another example are hooks which boost LP profitability, for instance, lending out out-of-range liquidity on Aave or Morpho, so benefiting LPs. So I think those two areas, just, you know, better experience for all users, and then customization as well.
Yeah, and I would say, like, for DeFi, we have a long way to go. The average user is still using centralized exchanges, just because the UX is like so much better. So on this front, we have to be pushing on like all fronts here, like you know, wallets, infra, you know, more user-facing stuff in DeFi, scaling, you know, the scaling of the infrastructure, like the blockchain itself. You know, this is the big focus of Ethereum recently, L2 scaling and all that. So we really got to push this on all sides. And where the superpower of DeFi comes in is the composability. So we, as the back-end infrastructure, say Maker and others, having that in place so that developers can come in and they have access to this great resource, which is, say, DAI liquidity, and then being able to build these like killer user experiences within the apps in DeFi. We need this, and the composability is the superpower of DeFi. We get this sort of exponential improvement from all fronts as everybody's working together, and it's not these siloed exchanges. And this is, you know, this is kind of the dream. We want to have the user experience of the centralized exchange, but without the downsides that we saw in 2022, most infamously with FTX and others.
Right, and I even add on this that it's specifically the separation from the protocol and the app that enables apps to specialize and to become, you know, very good at targeting one specific use case and, you know, enabling, for example, in the case of lending, like, you know, very specific risk profiles or very specific like user experience, like taking a leverage or getting financing to, you know, buy a house. Those are, every single one of those are different user experiences. And once you separate the protocol from the product, well, you can build specialized product that, you know, finally reach parity with Web 2 and like traditional finance or centralized finance, while benefiting from like aggregated states and composability, which makes it stronger than the Web 2 centralized finance world.
So do we think that perhaps in the future there'll be like a bifurcation between protocols like Uniswap or MakerDAO, where there will be on like a bottom layer, and then there will be more protocols built on top of that? Like I know you mentioned Arrakis Finance before as one example. Do you think that there will be sort of like a definite separation between those two types of DeFi protocols? Will that start to emerge?
So yeah, maybe I can like start on this one. Like the way it's done in Morpho. So like for those that are familiar with Aave and Compound, like the way lending has been working so far is like doing multiple things at the same time, notably lending and borrowing, but also risk management and aggregating different assets and a bunch of features in one protocol. And what MorphoBlue does essentially is separating the risk management layer from the protocol layer. And so in this model, yes, things get specialized. Like you have the protocol network layer, which is like extremely simple, on top of which you can have like risk managers or lending protocols like build their own vaults to have their own like lending specific experience. And in that case, things get specialized and they're able to, like generate their own fees at each layer, and it's much more like incentive line. So I think, yes, in that case, you'll have like clear separation, but in each areas of DeFi, I guess is going to be slightly different.
Paul, I would love actually, you should talk through the gauntlet announcement you just made. I want to talk too, but I think it's a really interesting
Yeah,
case.
no, you're right. Like I didn't mention it, but essentially like the way, in the case of lending, like, Gauntlet used to operate. Gauntlet is one of the best risk managers in the space, and they've been for a long time working as consultants for DAOs like lending protocols like Aave or Compound. And like when we started talking to them about this new model, well, in the Morpho paradigm, like they become the app, right? They, instead of being consultants, they become creators of the risk of a vault, and so they're now able to make fees directly from the usage of their risk management services, not as consultants. And this has proven to be a much more, economically efficient business model for them. And you probably have seen it like in the different governance forums recently. Like they decided to depart from the Aave DAO to build their Morpho vault. And yeah, and so they're perfectly on point for the topic of today, which is like you have the Morpho infra on top of which you have risk managers building their own pool. Like Gauntlet, for example, but others like Block Analytica, for example.
Yeah. And I think it's important to highlight the opening this up to a marketplace of risk providers is super important here. Because otherwise you kind of have these entrenched sort of like, maybe there could be improvements. I'm not saying anybody's doing a bad job at the moment, but you want these to be marketplaces such that there can be room for innovation and improvement on the risk management front. So I really do like the structure of MorphoBlue, how they've done this.
Yeah, and just to chime in from the AMM perspective, I think that the competition theme, the ability to open up to competition in terms of risk parameters, I think for Uniswap, you see that, you're already seeing it. If you go to uniswaphooks.com, there's more than 100 hooks which have already been built to get a nice array of how people are thinking about this. One thing I'll call out is you're able to actually innovate upon different curves, different demand curves for assets. That is like one very, very clear manner in which different hook developers can compete, and that competition will benefit all users across all types of assets. On top of that, I think the original question was about protocol development. Are new kinds of protocols going to be developed on top of these protocol platforms? The answer is definitely yes, but my team a few months ago when we last counted were talking to more than 20 teams considering developing protocols embedded within hooks themselves. And again, the kinds of protocols that folks are thinking about go from order flow auctions that are built into things like Suave and maybe outside of Suave, built on other kinds of incorporating other kinds of primitives to well, there's a wide variety out there that is going to be very exciting to see.
So it seems like, for example, with MakerDAO, you've gone the route of setting up these sub-DAOs that will build protocols on top of the main protocol. Uniswap doing things a bit differently, working with separate teams. So to take a more, I guess, like futuristic look, longer in the future, do you think there will ever be a point where protocols like MakerDAO and Uniswap and Morpho as well will become abstracted away to the same extent that maybe stuff like SMTP, which is backs all email, a lot of email communications today, people don't even realize they're using it. I guess the other point to that is Uniswap and everyone else, they have a really strong brand identity as well. So it's kind of, I imagine, difficult to balance those two things. What do we think?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think we see this already. So things like the DAI savings rate. Already we see some L2s launching where they they have this intrinsic yield in their stablecoin supply, and they just like plug into the DSR. And like the end user doesn't really know the details, and so we see this like all over the place. And I think this trend is just going to continue where the back-end infrastructure is providing all the usability for the protocol on top of it. But the end user, as long as they kind of trust the judgment of the intermediary protocol about where to allocate assets and stuff like that, yeah, you'll see more of this like abstracting away the underlying infrastructure.
Yeah, from Uniswap's perspective, I'd argue that Uniswap in many ways is already abstracted away. Uniswap pops up, is already integrated into OpenSea, friends with benefits, like tons of interfaces that allow for just easy swapping. So definitely see that trend continuing as more users on board.
Yeah, and I even add that you mentioned SMTP and HTTP, and I think that's absolutely right. Like, the direction where all of this is going is that we're rebuilding finance exactly like the internet, right? With those base protocols that have all the network effects, on top of which you have different layers like the risk management layers, the product layers on top, etc. And each layer has very competitive and open markets, like we mentioned the risk markets. And by the way, like you could tell it like right now on Morpho, like the fees charged by risk managers on vaults is so much lower than what is charged in current lending pools, right? And so you could already see the benefits of this. But also like the fact that you could, from a same base, an opinionated protocol, re-express different, apps with the same way, on SMTP, you have like different clients, right? That sort of like give you a certain expression of the mailing, basically. And they even complement the protocol with extra features, with encryption, et cetera, et cetera. I think there are definitely a parallel to be made with the internet, except now we transit not only just data, but data that has value. In that case, because that's enabled by the blockchain, and so that's why it's super suited for DeFi in general. So yeah, 100%.
So to focus on the second part of the question as well, does this cause a conflict with the strong brands that each of the protocols that you're from have created and nurtured that resonate with a lot of DeFi native people? But if DeFi is to scale to more and more users, those brands will get abstracted away. Is that something that's a conflict, or do you think it's something that isn't really worth talking about?
I do agree there's a tension. Like if you think of Uniswap, Uniswap is very unopinionated. You can list any asset, right? So some people are listing scams as tokens, right? And to some extent, the Uniswap brand can suffer from it if you're not a user that that you had the front end that was properly abstracting this away for you. And the same thing for MorphoBlue. The day we deployed MorphoBlue, we already had like scam markets being created, right? So I guess it's on the app layer to make the difference on what's allowed, what's not allowed, and even for compliance, right? Like if you think of emails, you can't send whatever you want through emails, right? That some things are prohibited depending on your jurisdiction, right? And it's on the side of the clients to sort of like, make sure like, certain rules are respected or people don't get scammed, et cetera, et cetera. And I think inevitably it will take a little bit of education to basically tell the user, oh, you have to make the difference between like the protocol and the risk decision that you're taking. And I think it's just like general education, because so far, protocols like Aave and Compound have, like users are getting used to having very risk-free experience where they get to deposit without thinking and assuming that everything will go well forever. But I think in the paradigm that we're talking about, it will have to be abstracted away through different layers.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all we have time for. And thank you everyone for coming, tuning in. And thanks to ETHDenver for organizing such an amazing event. Thank you.